G'day, guys. I've been looking at some of the economic implications of some of the crazy policies that have basically been coming out of the US in particular, and the Europeans sort of falling in lockstep with the Biden administration, and the consequences long term for Europe and the world in terms of economic stability and a potential massive economic global crisis that's actually has started, but pretty much nobody's focusing on at the moment or realizing is happening. If you look at the media, all the focus is on, spending a couple of million here to sort of for refugees and, a problem that the West created by encouraging the, the Ukrainian leadership to basically give the finger to Putin and exacerbating, by moving forces to the east to interact with the breakaway groups there, ignoring the Minsk II agreement that they were supposed to basically give them some sort of autonomy, respect their rights and stuff like that. They were encouraged by the Biden administration and the lunatics in the State Department to push hard the Russians, bring them to their knees. We failed in 91 when we brought down the Soviet Union. Let's try and do it now before we take on China. That's their thinking. These people are lunatics. They're crazy. When you're interdependent, when the world economy the way it is now is interdependent, the Soviet Union economy was separate. So the implications, there were no ramifications for the rest of us. Now the world economy is so integrated, the supply chains, financing, it's quite scary what's happening at the moment in that regard. I mean, you've probably all heard about some of the sanctions that are out there and stuff like that. Those minor sanctions and stuff like that are pretty much, against the oligarchs or, Putin's family or stuff like that. They're pretty much irrelevant. Russia's pretty much decoupled from the US dollar to a large extent. It trades in yuan, it trades in rupee, it trades in other currencies, and it's got its own transaction system anyway between banks and bank transactions. So, it's got a surplus all around. It's got a surplus in terms of currency. It's got a surplus in terms of, when we talk about trade surpluses, all around about 30% with China. So in that regard, and a massive surplus with Europe as well. But in that regard, Russia, people think that Russia's going to collapse. I think they're basically deluding themselves. I think it's more the West that's putting itself at risk of collapse than Russia. The problem is the mass media out there, pretty much the propaganda piece of Washington, pushing absolute nonsense, misinformation. Obviously, the Russians aren't having some difficulties, transferring thousands and thousands of troops along a vast territory like what the Ukraine is taking time. And Putin, for a long time, he was trying to avoid too much bloodshed of civilians. Now he's sort of stepping up the act, and because he realized he's running out of time to basically complete what he wants, because there's pressure at home by his own inner circle and people like that. So, I still do not endorse what he did. I still think that it was a violation of international law. It's wrong. Should have never done it. But at the same time, the US pushing, cajoling, pressuring, threatening. I've shown you the information with the hypersonic missiles that Lockheed Martin have developed. And if they were placed on the eastern side of the Ukraine, they could basically attack Moscow and many other major cities within European Russia. So for them, it was an existential threat. And if, like Finland in the past was sort of more a buffer state, stayed neutral. If the Ukraine was left to stay neutral, they could have come to an agreement, and they still can come to an agreement to leave the Ukraine as a neutral state. Both stay out, and in that way, it threatens no one, neither the West or that. It creates a buffer state, which means that it's, it limits the capacity of either one to use it as a transit against the other. It would basically increase security on the European continent and diffuse the nightmare, or the nightmares both on the economic front and potentially the military front, if they were to escalate beyond that point. But beyond that, the refugee crisis and all that, currently the media are focusing on, nobody's focusing on the economy. I think everybody's sort of ignoring all this. They don't realize the ramifications. And this video is sort of really to look at these ramifications and what's happening. Now, you've probably heard something about the SWIFT system. Now, the SWIFT system is a transaction system that's used by, the headquarters is based in Belgium, but it's one of the biggest, like per day, per hour type transactions. Something like $500 billion go through it. So there's a lot of transactions that go through it, where the equivalent of the Chinese, even though all the banks of the world and all that are tied into that, is about $30 billion. So there's quite a sizable difference between the two. But most of the banking system uses both those two, and some countries use the Russian one as well. So the Russians have got their own. It's called the SPFS. Let me just share my screen so I'm not. Okay, so this is the SWIFT. So it's interbank financial communications, because that's really what it is. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Communication. So if I send money from my bank account to somebody else's bank account, SWIFT transactions are basically a sort of like a bit like blockchain technology, which validates the transaction. It's not the payment, it's the actual validation. It's a validation system that this is a bona fide transaction. It's a true transaction. It's not a bullshit transaction. It's a real transaction. Got it? And so it's really important in basically to be able to validate transactions to make sure that they do happen in a proper way, without anything going wrong. This is the Russian system. So the Russian system, the FPSF, is basically a system for the transfer of financial messages, because that's what it is, basically a message sent and saying, yep, this is a bona fide transaction, accept it. That's what it is. It's a Russian equivalent of the SWIFT financial transfer system. So there's a couple of countries that's quite interesting. There's about 23 foreign banks that are connected to it. Also from Armenia, Belarus, Germany, interesting. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Switzerland. Also, the Indian banks also work through it, and so does the Chinese payment system also interacts with this. So banks in China as well and in India do interact with this system. So with this system, and there's actually other countries like Turkey and Iran also that interact with that system. So these countries can still maintain payments, and I believe the United Arab Emirates as well is in that as well from memory. Yeah, so that's the sort of a number of countries that are into that. Then there's the Chinese one, which is the cross-bank interbank payment system. And that's got far more, pretty much all the global banks are linked to it. Pretty much the big ones HSBC, Standard Chartered, Bank of East Asia, that's the DBS, the Development Bank, Singapore, Citibank, Australian ANZ in Australia, and New Zealand Banking Group, the French PNP, and a number of others. So that's some of the big global ones, and there are many other minor ones and many others that actually use the Chinese CIPS system. So that's basically what's involved in that sort of stuff now. And this is sort of quite important, something that I've become aware of in terms of the SWIFT system. Just recently, the French finance minister, Bruno Maire, I believe his name is, he basically made it clear that about $30 billion of transactions, that means payments haven't happened. That means from Russia to basically European nations and stuff like that. Now, obviously, I'm just going to unshare that. I don't need that. Now, obviously, these transactions, so you've got the sort of transactions that are happening, need to basically be maintained. So there are contracts, monthly contracts and stuff like that. Currently, about 30 billion are outstanding. That means a whole lot of companies in Europe at the moment are having a bit of a cash flow issue. Cash flow issues can flow on to become credit crises in Europe. If this is exacerbated month over month over month. So if the Americans and the Europeans continue along this line of basically bringing in sanctions without thinking, because these politicians, not economists, many of them are lawyers or many other professions, and are not thinking straight, and are sort of on this ideological, we're going to punish Russia type attitude, rather than thinking the consequences, this could blow in their face completely. And I'm not kidding, could blow in their face. These transactions, once they start to escalate the contracts that need to be paid, those payments do not happen through the SWIFT system. And many of the countries in Europe are not connected to the SPFS system. And there's also potential that the Americans may pass legislation to prevent that. That really causes massive problems in Europe. If these transactions start breaking down, which are very important within the banking system, you could have, flow on month by month, multiple amounts. By worst case scenario to best case scenario, depends who you talk to, or what. It could be quite bad for Europe. The potential risk is that you could have up to, a lot of people are saying, well, it's going to be small, but the potential could be up to a quarter of small businesses in Europe could go to the wall completely. So, and medium-sized business and all that. So you've potentially got, 15, maybe 20% of the economy going. That's quite a bit. That's quite a bit. I mean, last time that we had this sort of massive collapse was when Russia in 91 sort of collapsed, and they had like a reduction of their own economy contracted by about 40%. So even a 20% is massive, people, is massive. Could be higher. None of us know. We're in uncharted territory. The other thing is China and Russia are surplus nations. So is India. The West isn't. we're up to our eyeballs in debt, most of the West, excluding Germany. And Germany is connected to the Russian transaction system and the Chinese one, which means that they can actually do transactions unless the Americans decide to put certain legislative conditions on that. Then that could be a big blowback. You have to remember that the Chinese have something like 4 trillion in holdings. And so there's about 1 trillion in their central bank in terms of bonds that they're holding, and they're holding in their commercial banks about another trillion. So that's a lot of money, you know. So if the Russians, who have got a trade situation with about 30% of their trade is tied to the Chinese and growing, and there's a whole lot of contracts there and all that, potential, and the Chinese are reliant on guaranteeing that Russia provides those raw materials because other countries may be questionable for their own economic security. There's the potential for sanctions against China. That would be a disaster. You talk about a minor credit crunch in Europe and potentially affecting some of the Western world. And in a time when we've got high inflation, potentially going to stagflation because these morons since 2014 did not basically discouraged investment in petrochemical, you know, products. So pretty much exploration of oil and gas in most Western countries was off the table due to environmental considerations. So we find ourselves where investments in, you know, oil and gas halved since 2015 onwards. So we've seen a major contraction in terms of that. And now we're about to blow up the whole financial transaction system of the world. Welcome to the new reset. So things are not looking very good if they play out in the worst case scenario. Unfortunately, we've got ideologues and lunatics in the White House that are basically, and now they've fermented, and the media have fermented this hatred, vitriolic hatred towards Russia. It could extend eventually, this fanaticism could extend to the Chinese. And if that was to happen, the decoupling, the West is up to its eyeballs, and its creditors, China, Russia, others, could basically decouple themselves from the US dollar completely, and the US economy would be in free fall because of lack of liquidity. Because these countries who are surplus countries put their money through the Western banking system because that's where they invest it, because that's where the biggest growth is. That's why they do it. But if basically the future growth of those economies, one, because of the inflationary pressures, two, because of you know, affecting world transactions and world trade due to sanctions and all that, this could have a massive blowback. I mean, currently, as the French finance minister, Bruno Maire, has pointed out, it's the initial blow to Europe is 30 billion you know, dollars, but that could go much higher. Month in, month out, could have a devastating effect on Europe, on Europe's economy. Already Europe has struggled and suffered quite a bit. And I don't think even Lagarde actually gets it. She's more focused on, you know, sort of assisting governments and, you know, with their issues that they're currently having, or assisting basically governments with additional, like Eastern European countries, with additional finance. So they can actually, you know, with bonds, they can finance some of the immigration, sort of refugees sort of activity and stuff like that. This is where the focus is. not on the potential for this massive credit crunch in Europe that's coming. Because if these payments don't happen, it has a flow-on effect. That means some of these companies, then they're not getting their payments. They can't make their payments to other companies, and other companies can't make it to their banks and whatever. And it has a flow-on effect on the credit system. You have a credit crunch because of this liquidity shrinkage that actually happens abruptly. And that's what's happening very abruptly, especially if these sanctions go in with a SWIFT. They extend to, to basically prevent other avenues of transaction. Things could get really nasty. I don't think these people realize what they're doing. They're really unleashed, hell on earth without realizing it. These people have lost the plot. There are other ways of basically pressuring other states to force them into compromised positions. The way the world is interdependent on the financial front, and the weaknesses at the current, when it comes to energy, the energy crisis as well, we can't afford a massive economic war, because that's what will happen. And pretty much people that have got money, they'll race to the creditor countries, because they're not going to stay. They're going to move out of the US dollar. They're going to move out of the euro. And you will see a collapse of the euro and a collapse of the US dollar as these investors pull out to go to safe havens. I know a number of top American investors that have already moved to Hong Kong and elsewhere and said goodbye to America. So, wealthy people don't have any country. For them, it's basically where they get the most benefits. You need to understand that, the elites, they'll look after themselves first, and they'll abandon any country and every country if necessary to survive. So the reality is things aren't looking that good. We're playing with fire. These sanctions that the Congress in the US is actually talking about, and Biden has been pushing through the Congress with the SWIFT transactions, this messaging system. And if these payments do not happen, Europe will be the first domino. Western Europe will suffer the most. And then after that, it could go global. That's the danger. Because once the confidence in the system starts breaking down, and the US starts sanctioning China for transacting with Russia and other things like that, then it really can become hairy, because they can pull up the drawbridge, and they've got a massive landmass, all the Eurasian area. I would see Germany then breaking off and joining with that group. The whole thing is, why is America doing this? America's trying to break, it was involved in its war on terror and all that, and basically took its finger off the pulse, pretty much allowed Japan, Europe, other countries to do their own thing. In the past, they kept a tight rein to maintain global stability, that everybody was following the same rules. What's actually happened is, as economic friction has happened, other people have gone into investing in other partnerships, the Germans with the Russians and others, because they could see that they could gain economically more by doing those transactions and getting into those relationships. So, and the Americans initially encouraged those things. Now they've changed their foot, because they've realized they're losing their dominance. This is a superpower that basically doesn't want to lose out, wants to bring Europe to its knees, to basically fall into line. That's what it is. This whole Ukrainian crisis is to create a crisis to be able to force all those European NATO countries back under the American, control. That's what it is. But as a consequence of doing that, they're basically, let's say, throwing a lot of fuel into a fire which has just started. And I don't think they realize that they could have done it in a much more softer way, but they thought by creating this basically massive animosity and all that, Look at what's Germany's done. Germany's actually already said that they're going to spend $100 billion arming. What does that tell you? That's what the Americans want. You know, look at Trump came over, said to the Europeans, you need to spend more on your defense and not be so friendly with some of these other countries. So, you know, both of them are on the same page, more or less. They have differences, you know, the way they approach their policies, but it was all basically that, you know, America is back. That was the attitude. America is back and we're going to tell you what to do. And pretty much many of the other countries said, really? You're going to tell us what to do? So, you know, you're a declining empire. You know, you can either basically be cooperative if you push us around, and basically that's what the whole Ukrainian issue is, to force the issue, force a crisis with the Russians by creating an existential threat for the Russians, and then forcing the Europeans to fall into line. But as a consequence, because of the interdependency, economic interdependency that exists, what's actually going to happen is a blowback. The blowback is going to be financial, and it's going to be massive. And it's the wrong, you know, if you talk about bad timing, you know, you know, with the risk and threat of stagflation due to the underinvestment in oil and gas, due to their woke environmental crap. And now on top of that, this sort of financial blowback in the payment systems and all that. And if they were to go really hard on those sanctions, it would basically mean massive repayments didn't happen and transactions fell apart, contracts fell apart. And in a financial system, when contracts start falling apart, what happens is people their confidence starts falling apart as well. And remember also, this financial crisis is being magnified also by the oil crisis. That's a problem in itself, because when people invest in stuff in a country, you could actually print money as much as you like. If your productivity is going down due to oil, the cost of energy, remember what I said ages ago, the energy is the energy potentiality of the system. At the foundation is energy. That's what we used to call it petrodollars. At the foundation is energy, all forms of energy. It's the energy potentiality of the system. The potential for the system to produce goods and services is at the heart energy. To run these big data centers so you can actually have your Googles and whatever else requires energy. Energy is required to do everything. The difference between, you know, horsepower in the past, which was limited, gave us a certain level of living standards. The sort of energy we can produce nowadays gives us a much higher living standards. When the energy levels in the system decline on a per capita basis, which means per person, so does our living standards. Our living standards are starting to decline. We don't need these additional crises to magnify that decline. And all we're doing is printing money and pushing up assets, which are unsustainable, because eventually those who are lending the money are going to go, long-term future returns on those investments is going to be shit. I better pull out. So what are they going to pull out of many of the Western countries that are over indebted and have got contracting economies? You know, you can, you know, Zimbabwe printing money. They collapsed their own export industry, their farmers and all that they kicked out all the people that have had the competencies, you know, to try and take over, collapse their economy, shrank their economy. You can print as much money as you like. You're not going to basically recover. You're just going to implode. Printing money isn't going to fix the problem, especially when you've got, you know, this inflationary pressure at the same time in the system and a contraction in the real economy. That means those who are lending, the investors, those elites, they're going to basically go, I'm going to abandon this system, this country or that country, because I'm going to be losing on those. That's the problem. That's the big risk at the moment. So we're in very precarious times, very dangerous times. And most people don't realize that what I call the sanctions on the SWIFT system is, you could say, it could be that the trigger that triggers this whole thing off. There's all these other pressures in the system, and this could be the thing that broke the camel's back. So people that are in America, please call your senator and your congressman and try to reason with them and try to talk some sense in them before they actually blow up the whole world economy. Because these people don't know what they're doing currently, and nobody's talking about it, you know. And it's unfortunate nobody's talking about it, that it's going to catch us with our pants down. Yeah, it's not something, when I looked at it, because I've been looking at certain stuff and then I've been thinking about it and I'm going, this isn't looking good and all that. Then that, when the French finance minister said $30 billion, you know, just as a first, you know, some of the contracts that are coming through, and they're not being settled, and I'm going, God damn, what's the extent of this? And you look at the extent and it's just 30 billion next month, you know, another big amount of billions, and, you know, on, and you're going, what's this going to look like by the end of the year? It's a lot of money, let's put it that way. You start doing that and contracting the economy and increasing, lowering the productivity, shrinking European economies. What's that going to look like down the track? What sort of confidence is that going to, you know, erode in the system? Quite a bit, I would say. We're living in very dangerous times. And I think even people in Europe need to call their politicians and tell them to stop this nonsense. Yes, pressure needs to be, but remember, it was the Biden administration that actually created the existential threat for Russia. Again, for their own, you know, the Democrats, again, for their own crazy reasons, thinking that they can force everybody under their, you know, America is back. Yes, we've seen it. This is the result of America being back. I don't think many Americans agree with that sort of attitude. You know, they don't want to basically be the police dog of the world. It costs a lot of money, and it means there's very little. If you take a look at America, cities dilapidated, roads dilapidated, bridges falling apart, infrastructure all over the place, a mess, in decline. People's living standards are pretty poor. Many Americans are on the street, never recovered from 2009. It's a mess. And rather than basically trying to put people back to work, investing in their domestic economies to rebuild bridges and roads and all sorts of infrastructure, invest in high technology and R&D in certain critical technologies, encourage new innovations and stuff like that, and try to rebuild the industrial base of the US and areas like that, and shrink the parasitic finance system to really create real good jobs for the average American. That's not happening. These financiers basically are just running the system on debt, because debt means that they can extract their own blood from the system, because that's what it is. A debt system is a parasitic system. Banks need to generate more debt. Without generating more debt, you can't get income. That's how they make their money, by loaning out money. So they get it cheap from the Fed and keep on loaning it. You know, it doesn't create jobs, real jobs, and sustainable and good quality jobs for Americans, or improve their living standards. What it does is it makes a small elite excessively wealthy on cheap credit, and where they can buy up everything because they can overinflate everything. But they overstep the mark. And also, when you overstep the mark and You also undermine your own cheap energy because they forgot the cardinal rule. It's energy. Basically, it always has been energy at the basis of any system, but they ignored that basic fundamental fact that many in the past knew. Petrodollars weren't some invention. They really knew that energy was at the foundation of any system, any economic system. The reason why the British, through the Industrial Revolution, had cheaper energy through coal and were able to build an industrial engine that was able to dominate the planet and create such high productivity, they could outcompete populations with much bigger societies with much bigger populations from their sheer productivity. This is one thing we've forgotten because we're so disconnected from so many things, and it's all this woke nonsense. We're not focusing on what are important. What are important in our education systems, the 3 R's. You need to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic, basically. And most kids nowadays are failing in that respect, where Chinese kids are way ahead. You can see them, even the Chinese kids in America are at the top. Australia, elsewhere, many of these kids that are still come from these traditional families who value education. American families used to value education as well in the past. But that whole attitude and view of education was eroded because it was corrupted. And that's largely why these things have fallen apart, and pretty much, it's always a bit of a mess there. Situation is not looking good. I'd obviously wouldn't recommend people, put a bit of gold and silver aside because you'll need it if things really go bad. If you can lower your debt threshold, that would be a good thing as well to do. Especially if it's debt that doesn't produce actually any income, that's cash flow. It's going to be a problem, and you have to look at the industry you're in and whatever else. What are the interdependencies, and could there be your own supply base or your own market base that shrinks potentially? What is your energy requirements for the activities you do? That could be a problem as well for whatever you're in. So it's a lot of things that people need to look at and consider. I'm not one for bad tidings, but I think it's important for people to be warned of the risks, and that some of these policies and strategies that are being at the moment pushed through without thought, where we're like stampeding sheep over the cliff. It's sort of just, we're in this, Russia's bad, we need to punish them. Yes, they did the wrong thing by violating a cardinal rule of international law, invading another country. But it's a whole lot of reasons why they were pushed that far. Existential threats. Had the Biden administration went to Russia and said, look, we'll allow them to become part of the EU, but we won't, so they can integrate economically if they want to, but not part of NATO. They'll remain a military neutral country for any current and future alliances, which means that they would not be able to join any alliance. And there'd be a treaty which major powers would sign together with the Ukraine, which would guarantee that the Ukraine never became a threat to either side. So Russia couldn't put her tanks on the west side, and the Americans couldn't put their tanks and missiles on the east side. It would be a true buffer state, and it would diffuse a lot of the issues in regards to that. But unfortunately, when politicians are always ideological rather than practical, and they're in this sort of game of winner takes all, well, sometimes the blowback can be quite damaging to your own side. And from what I can see is the risk for massive blowback, economical blowback to a more indebted West is potentially massive. I don't think people have realized the risk, especially if they start escalating beyond Russia to the bank, to the the Chinese payment system, which is the CBIPS system. Yeah, all bets are off at that stage, and these are the risks. So I think people need to take these things into consideration and make some preparations for the future, because if things continue to escalate the way they're going, they may not be as rosy. So anyway, guys, that's about it. Anyway, take care. See yous.